This video isn't monetized. If you wish to support me, there will be a link to my Patreon in the description below. It will be a long video, it's a personal video, but it's one that I think is incredibly important, possibly the most important I've ever made. If you do have the time, then please do give it a watch and let me know your thoughts and let me know how you feel we can help this very, very sad situation. There's a statistic which I'm sure you've all heard, and to be completely honest with you, I'm sick and tired of hearing. And that's not because I wish people would shut up about it. Quite conversely, I wish more people would speak up about it. The biggest killer of men under 50 in the UK and in many other countries is suicide. It's not cancer, not road accidents, not the brave men fighting wars which they may not even agree with. No, the biggest killer of young men in the UK is themselves. And the root cause is nearly always the same: addiction and depression. I'll probably say some things in this video that are unpopular, things that are contrary to societally acceptable narratives. However, whilst it may be hanging on by a thread, we do still, in theory at least, live in a country of free speech, and I will use the tiny platform I have to fully exercise that right. The discussion around men's mental health has thankfully grown in recent years. Many groups, many charities and organisations, including Gambling with Lives, have set out to get people talking about this very real danger. Their aim is often simple: to destigmatise men's mental health, allowing them to reach out for support and talk without shame. But in spite of the noble efforts of many, far more needs to be done. We can treat depression, we can work through addiction, we can't fix suicide. The finality of it at the hand of just a moment's action is one of its most dangerous traits. You may think it wouldn't happen to you, but in many of us, I think it's closer to the surface than we'd ever care to believe or acknowledge. I know that despite my best work, it's still closer to the surface of my mind than I would ever like to think. It speaks volumes how 3 of the most listened to songs on my Spotify directly address the topic. These are the 3 songs that most poignantly draw emotions from me. They were songs that I know all the lyrics to and will often find myself singing along to passionately in moments of weakness. Just for your interest, those songs are A Reason to Fight by Disturbed, A Song for Joe by Ren, and a very personal one, How to Save a Life by The Fray, a song that reminds me of a friend that I lost personally to depression. I opened this video with a statistic, how suicide was the biggest risk, the one thing most likely to take the lives of a certain group. Yet this petrifying statistic, the national health emergency, still remains largely ignored, at least downplayed by both the mainstream and by the government and those areas of government tasked with allocating resources to matters of national importance. More men are being killed as a result of this epidemic than being taken by overseas wars they had no sign of fighting. Yet expenditure on addiction treatment, mental health care and suicide prevention on a national level pales into insignificance compared to what we spend on arms. In a painful twist of sickening irony, we will spend more as a nation putting a young man on the front line in Ukraine than we will supporting him with the mental health issues that he may well develop as a result. So why? Why is this very real threat to life so well documented, yet those in power appear to be doing fuck all about it? Let's look at a couple more statistics and see if we can better understand why we are so blissfully willing as a society to ignore this killer. More than 3/4 of all suicide victims are men. Of those men, the majority are white or of mixed race. Nothing is gained by being divisive. Society is divisive enough, and this is not my intent with this video. However, it's a bit of a fucking coincidence that an epidemic which affects mostly young white men is dismissed so easily by the mainstream. A group whom it has been societally acceptable to vilify, to ridicule and to berate. A group being let down by our education systems, our court systems, and a group blamed for so many of society's ills. If we want to address the problem, and we fucking need to as a matter of national emergency, we need to look at a shift in society that is exacerbating this hideous statistic. A statistic which shows no signs of relenting and without a real shift in outlook is only going to get worse. It's upsetting to me that I have to put a disclaimer in, but I will at this point. I'm not denying that depression and addiction and suicide also affect women. I'm not suggesting there aren't issues that overwhelmingly or indeed solely affect women, and I'm not denying or belittling the tragedy of a life lost that doesn't fall within the demographic that I'm talking about. It should go without saying. Isn't it ironic, though, that if I were talking about an issue which so overwhelmingly affected women, or was more prevalent in non-white groups, there'd be no need for this disclaimer? And surely this is part of the problem. We've developed a societal standard that puts the solution to male issues solely in the hands of the affected group. Men are told to talk up about their mental health battles, but are simultaneously surrounded by voices telling them to just deal with it, or worse still, man up. Boys and young men are now growing up in a society where their very inbuilt characteristics, values and genetic advantages are mocked, belittled, and in so many cases demonised by society. Thankfully, we no longer have to go out and physically hunt in order to provide food. We don't have to fight in order to protect our families, and mass procreation is no longer essential to the survival of the species. But these intrinsic desires remain. Whilst advancements in society have made life more comfortable, most men still have an underlying urge to provide, protect and procreate. Until recently, the ideal of starting a family, working to provide them and protecting them from any harm was still considered normal, and dare I say an aspirational role for your typical man. Fast forward to 2023, boys and men are confused. Ostracised by society, the very characteristics that made them, and still make them, valuable to society, degraded, vilified, labelled as toxic, or simply dismissed as worthless. What further perpetuates this feeling of confusion, of helplessness, is a disgusting hypocrisy in societal standards which is widely accepted. And that is the hypocrisy in the expectations of men. If we want to be a provider, the modern hunter-gatherer, and ensure that your family have a roof over their heads, then you're told three things. Your position is defunct. Society doesn't need men to provide anymore. Women can do it by themselves. Thankfully, we do have a more equal society now when it comes to work, and I have no argument with this. Whilst this has the potential to rob, to some extent, young men of their most genetically inherent functions, they are then confronted with another set of societal standards which shouldn't, but does, manage to somehow run parallel to this. If you don't work to support your family, you're a deadbeat, you're a loser, you are a worthless male. Despite this so-called equality, men are still judged on their ability to earn, and thanks partially to the poison of social media, and indeed online dating, high monetary worth is more than ever considered to be a measure of success and a measure of viability if you're a male when it comes to finding a partner. So you can forgive young men for being confused. Should they attempt to adopt the traditional male role and be called a misogynistic, traditionalistic and obsolete dinosaur, or opt out and be considered a loser or a deadbeat and dismissed by society and by most potential partners? Thankfully, the frequency with which we have to physically fight has reduced exponentially over centuries. However, this isn't to say it should be dismissed as a positive male attribute, and certainly not branded toxic. I'm not suggesting that having a scrap outside the lamb and flag increases your worth as a male, any more than it makes you a drunken, argumentative idiot. But to confine physical strength to the history books would be harmful to all in society. Again, however, boys and men are put in a state of helplessness. Helpless confusion by the expectations imposed on them. If you want to be fit, do martial arts, go to the gym, and even fight. Even if you don't need to, you are again considered to be a dinosaur, a relic of times gone by. The very stigma given to the expression boys will be boys, when applied to physical play or rough and tumble, would suggest that boys should be discouraged from conflict, or at the very least, maintaining a level of physicality which would enable them to resolve a physical conflict should be vilified. But again, just when boys have accepted that one of their most deeply ingrained traits and urges should be suppressed, society immediately contradicts itself. A weak man is a dangerous thing. A man who doesn't take care of himself physically is less of a man. And an overweight man, unlike overweight women, are still a legitimate target for ridicule. On one hand, we are being told that aggression, strength and competitiveness are toxic, but without them, you're labelled weak. An interesting point on that. Isn't it odd how traditionally male masculine traits, such as strength, aggression and competitiveness, are dismissed, nay vilified in men, but now celebrated in women? The England women's football team recently made the final of the World Cup. They were dubbed the Lionesses. They were praised for all the traits that they were typically associated with masculinity. strength, aggression, fearlessness. Women in business are often praised in the same way, being praised as being ruthless or uncompromising. Again, masculine traits that in men would be labelled as toxic. In the end though, fucked up societal standards will never overrule biology. As much as some might wish to deny biology, women will always be attracted to most women will always be attracted to men who display more masculine traits. A man in better shape is not just more physically attractive, but they are better set to provide. They will be better with children. They're able to interact, to play more with your offspring. And more importantly, they will live longer to support them as they grow up. Which brings me to the final male characteristic I touched upon, and that is the desire to procreate. Now, this is something that you may not wish to think about, but I'll say it without any hint of irony. I grew up from an early-ish age with a very, very strong sexual desire. And my desire, I was able to some extent, placate by embracing that primal urge to go out and mate, find a mate. It's what we used to call pulling back in the day. The idea that you could go out and find a partner who may turn into a long-term partner, may literally just be a way of satiating mutually a primal urge that was deep set within us. That, when I was growing up, was acceptable. Should I find myself now as a 40-something-year-old male in the same position, say I was single, and I still had this overwhelming, insatiable primal urge within me, one of the many urges we have as a man that is laced in testosterone, then to take any attempt to make any steps to rectify, to placate this urge, to satisfy a very primal instinct would be labelled as toxic. The very action of approaching a female in a bar or wherever and asking if they want a drink or a dance or requesting their phone number would be considered misogynistic, predatory even, and even if on the off chance that this is acceptable, we are told through the media that we are still predators. Despite acting with the best of intentions, you could find a young lady, she could take you back to her apartment, house, whatever. She could be undressed in the bedroom and then at the drop of a hat say she changed her mind. And high-profile court cases have led men to be afraid. Now, I appreciate this is very, very much the minority. But again, this overwhelming urge for the mainstream, the media and social media to vilify men has meant that those very rare cases where men are falsely accused are widely spread and lead to a fear and confusion amongst young men who then withdraw from this desire to satisfy one of their most inbuilt desires. And that isn't just for sex, it is ultimately to procreate, to build a family that they then provide for and protect. But to deny our humanity is foolishness. There's ironies here. The irony is that in a society which dismisses male sexuality as toxic and aggressive and predatory, we have developed things like Tinder, which have made it so much more accessible for these fleeting encounters to occur. The irony of Tinder is that it preys upon this urge but doesn't require any of the other facets of masculinity to operate. There's a significant imbalance in Tinder, whereas the people that have been vilified previously, the strong ones, the fit ones, the ones that are able to provide, rise to the top of the tree. The ones with the money, the ones with the muscles are the ones that get the swipes. They are the top 10% of men who get the top 90% of women, and I believe that is actually a statistic. The hypocrisy of this is that the same mediums that have been telling us that all these masculine traits are toxic and harmful are the same mediums that allow the people indulging with these traits, or that embrace these traits, or work to develop these very characteristics. They're the same mediums that afford those people the greatest rewards in terms of at least one of their primal urges. This imbalance, this hypocrisy and this confusion amongst boys and young men has a tendency to lead them in one of two directions. Toughen up in the light of criticism. Work on yourself physically. Go to the gym. Take up martial arts. Build your business. Do things that whilst considered toxic or in many respects dismissed as worthless male traits, continue to build them, work on them, develop them, and become a better person, a better version of you. Ultimately, this will be the right solution. But the other option is to opt out. And we are seeing this more and more in society. Men who are opting out, boys who are opting out of their traditional roles because of the way they are seen by society as a whole. There seems to be two ways in which men or boys choose to opt out of society. Many choose to opt out actively. And if you only need to look at movements like MGTOW, men go their own way, as evidence of this active opting out of traditional male masculine roles. The problem with motions and movements like this is that they form an echo chamber, a confirmation bias, and they build anger, resentment, and ultimately ending in mental health issues. Society becomes more divisive. They believe that women and females are the problem and not the only real solution to the deprivation of their true characteristics. There are substantial mental health issues that have been known to be associated with this active opting out. A group of disenfranchised, confused men choosing a common enemy as a means to pin their frustration and their confusion on someone or something. There's an expression when it comes to school shooters that we know what they look like before we know what they look like. And these are almost generally young, disenfranchised men. Men who have been robbed of their direction, who then find solace in groups of like-minded individuals who can perpetuate their own toxic traits. And then there are those that passively opt out of society, subconsciously deciding to not bother, living their lives not as, asexual or not interested in, people of the opposite sex or indeed the same sex, but people who don't bother, people who can't see the effort and indeed seek to gratify themselves, seek to get that same level of satisfaction, gratification to their urges using less productive, more harmful and far more highly addictive substances and behaviours. Women aren't to be blamed for this. It's not women's fault. It's society that is to be blamed for this. We are all to blame for this. We are all to blame because we allow expectations and acceptability to be perpetuated. We have allowed, through political correctness, wokeness and social media, we've allowed a narrative to develop which leaves boys and young men feeling confused about their role in life, being told of all the responsibilities they have, but being denied their true value. And because of this, we see an increase in addiction. People turning to satisfy themselves, to distance themselves, to busy themselves, and to wend away their lives in other activities. No longer being constructive, no longer choosing to build a family, support and protect that family, and we find solace in gambling, in alcohol, in drugs, and in video games. Again, there is a reason, there is a stereotype around these people who actively opt out of dating and of relationships. There is a scary statistic about the sheer proportion of young males who are not looking for a long-term or indeed even short-term, and in that you can read a one-night stand or indeed just sex relationship, and instead are finding solace in video games and forums and other forms of, echo chambery, if we will, that can further perpetuate their anger and frustration with society. There is good news. And the good news is that the world is still by and large filled with good people with good strong values. For whatever reason it is seen as constructive, and it might be because of algorithms, that those who are the most divisive, those who have opinions and outlooks that are most harmful to society, are given the platform to speak them. Most women still have good traditional values and want a traditional masculine man, sure. And this is a positive thing. We have become more equal in society. We are able to make decisions between ourselves as partners and as families as to where our efforts, our work and our abilities are best displayed. But most women still want a man with masculine traits in the same way that most men still want a woman with feminine traits. But if we are to address this underlying problem of addiction, depression and suicide within young men, we need to give them a path. We need to let them know what is expected of them. We need to give them goals, and we need to let them know that they are worthwhile. They do have value, and that those inherent masculine traits they have aren't toxic. They have to be maintained, and they have to not be let out in a dangerous and harmful way. But having those inbuilt desires, those inbuilt characteristics, those inbuilt traits, and the inbuilt will to build, to protect, to provide is not a negative thing. I just really wanted to talk about that. I don't have a solution. I think we as a society need a solution, and I think that people who help perpetuate these ideals are the true aggressors in this situation. And I'm talking about the people who perpetuate extreme feminism, the people who perpetuate the opposite end, those who are encouraging young men to opt out. We are not that far apart, but life and media, and social media in particular, the poison that is social media, will tell us we are. It will continue to divide us because that is what gains engagement, keeps us hooked, and perpetuates our addiction on the very thing that is dividing us in the first place. Stay safe and sane. Look after yourselves. There is plenty of support out there. I'll put some links in the description below. And like I say, this video won't be monetized. But if you do wish to support me, there will be a link to my Patreon down below. As I say, stay safe and sane, and please do take care of yourself. All the best.